Just jobs?
Just skills.
Just transition?
Just Europe.
Welcome to Just Europe, a podcast exploring the challenges we collectively face on the path to a fair and inclusive Europe, in which no one is left behind as we transition towards modernising, decarbonising and digitalising our economies. We bring you experts with insights, research expertise and innovative solutions that can help all of us benefit from the opportunities of Europe's green and digital transition, managing change together, regenerating disadvantaged communities and regions. It's all covered. The series also looks at identifying new ideas and research needs to support people, strengthen our social model and ensure a just transition for all. I'm your host, Katrina Sickle, and in the spotlight today is climate disinformation. Imagine you're scrolling through Facebook, you see a post saying the EU wants to ban gas boilers by next year. It's got thousands of shares, angry comments. You think, is this true? By the time fact checkers debunk it, a lot of people have seen it and perhaps also believe it. This is climate disinformation. So today we're asking, who is spreading these lies? Why do we fall for them? And how do we fight back? Joining me in the studio today is Max Falkenberg, computational social scientist and senior research fellow from King's College London. Max is also principal investigator for the Horizon-funded project POLARCLIMATE. He studies the polarisation of attitudes towards climate change on social media. Welcome, Max.
Hello, thank you.
Also joining us online is Jenny King, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and the Centre for Climate and Security, and co-founder of the global coalition Climate Action Against Disinformation. A warm welcome to you, Jenny.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, welcome to Paul Nemitz, also joining us online. Paul is visiting professor at the College of Europe, the oldest postgraduate institute of European studies. He's former advisor at the European Commission's Directorate General for Justice, where he led some of the EU's most consequential digital legislation, including the GDPR. And he's since become one of Europe's leading voices on democracy, artificial intelligence, and the rule of law. Hello, Paul.
Thank you for having me.
A pleasure. So let's get stuck in. Max, your research has grappled with the difficulty of defining what actually counts as disinformation versus healthy skepticism.
Let me start by separating two ideas. So there are ideas around misinformation and disinformation, which have to do with how information spreads. And then there are climate claims. The ideas around misinformation and disinformation are about whether a claim is true or not, and about whether there is intent to spread a claim which is inaccurate or false. The problem is that when we study this at scale online, it is often extremely hard to talk about intent. And there's a lot of grey area which makes it very hard to accurately assess why people are engaging with certain types of content. What people are doing more recently is starting to talk about the information ecosystem, and that's this idea of information integrity. In the context of climate change, why do we have what can be maybe described as an unhealthy information environment around climate change? So there's factual climate claims. There are evidently inaccurate climate claims. For instance, the EU is going to regulate against gas boilers within the next 12 months. But what exists in between is a lot of ambiguity, and it is this ambiguous space that a lot of people are grappling on, and which makes it very hard to really push rapid climate action.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive opening. And in it, we hear these words, information integrity. Jenny, does that resonate with you, what you heard there from Max?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think mis and disinformation can be an overly reductive lens, because actually a lot of what we're talking about is to do with emotional manipulation, paltering, which is where you take truthful information, but you decontextualize it in order to draw a false conclusion. So all of these things are ways of manipulating our information environments. So the kind of good faith public discourse that is absolutely critical at this point in time, and the very legitimate debates that need to happen about the pace of the transition, the nature of the transition, who stands to benefit and on what timeframes, those things can't actually happen because what we get stuck in is this kind of antechamber of discourse that is completely polluted and muddied by all of these fallacies.
Thank you very much. Paul, perhaps you could just chip in with this big picture on how this affects democracy. What are the democratic stakes of climate disinformation, misinformation on policymaking and democratic discourse?
Well, democracy, of course, requires that citizens are informed and have the knowledge at hand which allows them to take decisions as citizens which have rights and which really govern democracy. So if there is a lot of misinformation and propaganda and disinformation, we have a functioning problem for democracy because people can't participate anymore in the way they are supposed to participate. And so it is essential for democracy both to have a good journalism seeking truth, but also science to provide truth. And to be able to do this, both of them need to be independent. And the channels of distribution of information need to be policed. It's not only about a debate, it is about the legal framing of the information environment which is necessary to make democracy function.
Before moving forward, let's hear from some young professionals across Europe. Last week, we visited European Sustainable Energy Week in Brussels. So that's Europe's biggest event dedicated to renewables and efficient energy use. And we went there to meet 3 young energy and climate pact ambassadors. We played them some real soundbites circulating on social media, mixing climate denial, anti-renewable arguments, and lies about the EU. So let's hear their reactions.
As many as 8 in 10 Europeans believe humans cause climate change, and for good reason. Yet online, climate disinformation is rampant. Nearly half of Europeans do not trust the media as a source for climate information and feel exposed to inaccurate content on social media, where misleading climate narratives are most actively shared.
There is no climate change.
Wake up, guys. Global warming isn't real.
The IPCC is just a corrupt industry. Every single model that they ever have put out is wrong. They're trying to actually make you think that weather is something to be fearful of and that these things don't naturally happen, like forest fires.
The real solutions are just being pushed away. But when it comes to taxing people, regulating people, controlling their life, micromanaging every aspect of them, putting them in little eco-friendly, sustainable neighborhoods that you can't leave and you can only walk and bike around 15 minutes anywhere in one direction. When it comes to that, yeah, they love that.
Stop with your green scam. Majority of people in the European Union, they do not want to get rid of the fossil fuels.
What we've just heard is a compilation of the kind of content we see on social media every day, especially young people who get most of their news from these platforms. At the European Sustainable Energy Week in Brussels, young energy and climate pact ambassadors discussed the role of young people in the energy transition. We spoke with Sandy from Greece, Helena from Poland, and Mathilde from Italy about climate disinformation on social media.
I also used to get outraged when I was hearing these kinds of statements, but nowadays I just laugh it off because, I mean, information is there. It's so available. I think that climate change deniers are not that many anymore, but we do have a lot of people opposing renewables on a larger scale. We have seen the responsibility being put on the shoulders of citizens instead of the big polluters. So it really makes sense for some people to be that angry, but they actually do more damage, if we want to be honest. And I should remind everyone that negativity is always much louder.
I have to sadly disagree with Sandy. So in my case, in Poland, I think this sentiment is really growing. This year is fueled by what the politicians are saying, by also the winter that was quite harsh for the first time in 30 years. What I see, what I hear from people is that they feel somebody is telling them to do something and they don't know why.
Beyond fact-checking and refuting false claims, Building trust is clearly key for countering climate disinformation. For Mathilde, Sandy and Talina, talking to people on the ground is where that trust begins.
So in Italy, we are doing some activities like workshops with universities. Also, we speak about it on social media to create awareness and engagement on climate, energy and sustainable topics.
We do work a lot with local communities, so we want them to be engaged in the process, co-create, co-design, co-decide on how the energy transition will happen. It is important. I trust my neighborhood more than I trust someone that I haven't met yet. It makes sense, especially when you're not an energy expert per se.
There's a very lovely initiative in the Netherlands called Energy Fixers. Those are the young people that, let's say, go door to door and they spread the word about, for example, renovation possibilities, the possibilities to get grants and like so on and so on. If you're coming for coal regions, let's say, if you speak to people, they will tell you in schools they had, for example, lessons about the coal industry, the traditions that come with that. And why don't we introduce something like this regarding the climate, the renewable energy? This really should be, as Mathilde said, and as they are doing, really in the education process.
According to the European Digital Media Observatory, in 2025, climate was among the topics most targeted by online disinformation.
Very interesting. So much to unpack there. Now, Sandy, the young energy ambassador from Greece, argued that there are not many climate change deniers anymore. Jenny, your research has shown that there is strong public support to address the climate crisis. Can you tell us how narratives have evolved and which narratives are most prevalent today?
We're in a very different position in 2026 than we were in the year 2000. And information warfare has broadly shifted from what we would call traditional denialism to subtler and more sophisticated forms of delayism. And broadly speaking, you can break most information warfare down into what I call the four horsemen of the sort of mis and disinformation apocalypse. And that is not me, not like this, not now, and it's too late. And what you will find is that almost every piece of viral content that exists online that is opposing climate action, either at the broad level or sort of at the granular level of specific climate policies, fits somewhere into that matrix. And the idea is both that you weaken public resolve, that you increase the level of uncertainty and doubt within the electorate. And as a result, you destroy the public mandate that is essential to drive lawmakers and policymakers to pursue really bold and radical solutions.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to another moment. Halina, so that's our Climate Pact ambassador from Poland, disagreed, as she says she sees climate skepticism growing in Poland for different reasons. So how can these very powerful, emotional, locally embedded narratives be challenged?
That's a super interesting question. And I guess echoing a lot of what Jenny said, we have to appreciate that the way climate discourses have evolved is to exploit this space in the middle where there is ambiguity about climate policy. There's very little hardcore climate denial. Very few people are arguing against the reality of climate change, but it's now a policy question. So the problem with the local case of, for instance, coal mining in Poland, if you have a community whose jobs are dependent on coal mining, the way that the climate transition has been sold to them is that, yes, the climate transition will create jobs, but they are not jobs that are created today, and they're not jobs that are created here. Whereas the coal jobs, they are here, in our village, in our community, and we are going to lose them. And it's my perception that a lot of what is being exploited in this discussion is a failure to hold the hands of the people who are not natural allies of climate action. So we have to appreciate that there is legitimate policy debate on how to move forward on climate action, and that we have a responsibility to build trust. I know one of the speakers in the recording, she spoke about building trust, and I think if we just argue the coal mines have to shut down, green jobs will replace these, we have to acknowledge that at the local level, that's not how these things are perceived.
Let me just come back to you momentarily, Jenny, because we also heard from Halina there in the field report that the issue is also about people being told what to do without understanding why. Do you think that is a real entry point for disinformation to take hold?
I mean, what we know about disinformation is that it thrives in times of crisis. And it is true that every European country, and indeed many countries around the world, are now contending with multiple seismic crises all at once. These provide the fertile soil for conspiracy movements to thrive and for actors who would previously have sat on the fringes of public life to suddenly engage with and influence a mainstream audience. But I think that the point that you made is really important about coming at this from a position of empathy. People who are susceptible to climate myth and disinformation are not inherently extremist or conspiracy theorists. There is a huge amount of precarity and genuine fear and terror and dread about what the coming years are going to hold. And if we are disingenuous and we claim that the transition has no thorny aspects to it and no complexity, then we are absolutely going to alienate the general public because they know that that is untrue. They know that there are going to be trade-offs. And so I think that that has to be part of this conversation around information integrity and brokering discussion where climate action is something that's done with and by people and not just to them.
And that, of course, takes a lot of energy and commitment. Now, let us move from people to platforms and bring in Paul here, just to pick up on this conversation. Social media platforms and their algorithms, they prioritise emotional engagement, outrage, anger, fear. Can these platforms be fixed without the accusation of censoring debate?
Yes, certainly. There is a long tradition in Europe of law which shapes the space of debate, the public space, which is necessary for democracy to function. I think we can be proud about this tradition. And we have to recall that the platforms, they have to obey our law as any other economic actor. These platforms, they need to be regulated. It is my personal position that the duties of seeking the truth, the duty not to spread content which is false, should be extended to the platforms, especially where now we have a new phenomenon, which is automated production of content where humans don't speak anymore, but it's the machines speaking. And the machines are not benefiting and should not be benefiting from free speech rights. Free speech rights are for humans, not for machines.
Just coming back to Jenny on this, the fact that we know platforms, they're not neutral. Is there something we should understand about why platforms reward disinformation over truth? And what would you add to Paul's answer about how we can tackle this without this accusation of censoring debate?
So I would actually completely flip that accusation round and say that we are not living in a system where free speech can be enabled if public discourse is constantly being drowned out by vested interests, malign actors, coordinated deception. And it is common myth that we hold that social media are free speech environments. They have never been free speech environments. They have always been curated speech environments where the presentation of information on your newsfeed has always been determined by a set of digital infrastructure behind the scenes, algorithms that determine the prioritization of that content, the ranking of it. And as a result, it is a fallacy to say that social media companies have never inserted themselves as intermediaries in public discourse. If you want to have good faith dialogue about these kinds of issues, climate change, which includes legitimate grievances or potential controversies, then coming back to Paul's point, you have to have a common understanding of the basic facts. And otherwise, you are talking at cross paths constantly. You're talking in two separate universes. And that is what breeds paralysis. And indeed, that is the intended strategy of disinformation actors, is that they want to produce paralysis in the system because that prevents us ever moving forwards.
They want to produce paralysis in the system. Max, what would you add to what you've heard from your fellow speakers?
Perhaps I can controversially offer a slightly different perspective, which is, I think one of the challenges around this discussion, which is specific to climate change, is that a lot of these policy questions don't fall into a strict categorization of true and false. To give one example, a lot of discussion currently in climate science is around climate tipping points. There is a lot of uncertainty about how these will take place, when they will take place, how rapidly they act, how interconnected they are. And because there's uncertainty, there is no real way that we can regulate discussions around this space. You don't need to push false climate content in order to create this paralysis. You can simply seed doubt. So on the specific point of algorithms promoting false or outrageous content, I think we have to be very careful about what the evidence actually shows. There is a lot of debate in this space, and really what algorithms are prioritizing is engagement. So we see that outrageous content spreads more, misinformation spreads more, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's directly prioritizing that content. They are prioritizing all sorts of different little features that their AI algorithms have identified as making content popular. And regulating this kind of content is extremely difficult and extremely difficult to map. My argument would be that we need to actively promote solutions to climate actions that bring people together and perhaps worry less about the people we are not going to convince anyway.
I completely agree with Max, and I think that a lot of debate around this over-fixates on individual pieces of content. So what you are trying to litigate is every single post on social media, holding it up to some kind of standard and expecting an institution or an individual to determine whether it is legitimate or illegitimate. And what that obscures is the far bigger problem, which is the incentive systems that are baked into social media. And as Max is saying, the fact that they are prioritizing engagement, and unfortunately, hateful and incendiary and conspiratorial and misleading content has repeatedly been shown to garner engagement that far outweighs the kind of sober and nuanced discussion that you're going to get from institutions.
And I go back to the field report when I hear you say those words, sober and nuanced discussions, because we heard about the importance of speaking at grassroots level. People trust neighbours more than they do institutions. But Paul, let me come back to you. Here we heard, regulating this content's really tricky. You yourself, Paul, said platforms have to obey the law. So let's look at the Digital Services Act. The DSA came into force in 2022. It can fine platforms 6% of their global revenue for spreading disinformation. Now, under the DSA, have any climate disinformation cases been brought?
No, we have not seen this yet. But there is a potential. First of all, I have to agree with Max. This is not about regulating specific content substantively. This is about the general duties of the platforms. And the platforms have a general duty to identify risks. For example, negative effects on civic discourse and electoral processes. So I would say we can expect from the platforms that in their reports on their risk assessment, they address all the issues which we are discussing here, because these issues are at the core of civic discourse and also of electoral processes.
Let's move on now to generative AI. It can produce fake climate studies, deep fake experts, grassroots campaigns at scale. People feel it. In fact, 49% say it's difficult to differentiate between reliable information and disinformation about climate change on social media. So can platforms even detect these fakes, Jenny?
There's two major issues at play. So the first is the way that AI really turbocharges existing harms and continues to lower the barriers to entry for producing false or misleading or indeed just emotionally manipulative content at scale. So if you can imagine going to a chatbot or an LLM system and saying, give me 100 arguments against why somebody should buy an electric vehicle that are tailored very specifically for 50 different audiences with these different profiles. Now, a person could do that in the here and now, but it would be hugely labor intensive and they might not be able to do it across different media formats. And now they can automate that within a few minutes. The bigger issue is what I would call a poisoning the well strategy. And this is sometimes referred to as LLM grooming or LLM hacking. And this is trying to influence the training data that is used when a chatbot is providing a prompt response. And we have already seen that state-sponsored actors have been pursuing these kinds of strategies, and it is really going to be the new battleground for information warfare, because what AI is producing is what we'd call a zero-click environment. So somebody might go to ChatGPT and ask a question, and when they receive the response, they will never actually visit the primary source that is supposedly being cited. They will never visit the website that is being included in that reply. And as a result, if you can influence that training data, then you are actually changing the entire parameters of public understanding around entire topics without having to go and execute individual strategic communications campaigns across different social media platforms.
Thank you. And it's very sobering what you're saying there. And I'm going to turn back to Paul directly now. We talked about the DSA. What about the EU's AI Act? What does that say about AI-generated content, but also about transparency obligations? Can it actually help close an accountability gap?
Well, the AI Act is a first-generation attempt to give a legal shape to the digital environment, including now AI. So it's not perfect, but it provides tools. For example, the AI Act contains an interdiction of manipulation which people don't perceive. We're dealing with invisible risks, and people may be manipulated into, thinking these risks don't exist in a way that they don't even understand that they are being manipulated.
Right, let's just jump back at the field report. We heard the Young Energy Ambassador, Sandy, from Greece. She said that the negativity that you hear, the opposition, is much louder. Now, a recent global survey found out that 69% of people would pay 1% of their income to fight climate change. However, most think they are in a minority. Is that the case? How much is disinformation tricking us into thinking we're divided? What does your research tell us, Jenny?
So one of the cleverest outcomes of information warfare is to confer a false sense of consensus on minority opinions. So disinformation actors are generally highly motivated and highly vocal, and they flood the zone. Now, that has been shown to have a distinct impact on lawmakers and policymakers in particular. There have been studies in places like the UK and Europe that show lawmakers can underestimate by as much of a factor as 30 percentage points what they perceive public support is for climate action. So it does have a material impact on people's understanding of social norms and social tipping points. There is also something called the illusory truth effect. And what this means is that if you are exposed to a claim repeatedly, you are more likely to believe that it's true, even if you are coming across that claim in the context of a fact check or a debunk. So repeated exposure alone begins to increase the credibility of a claim. And one area where you're seeing that really have an effect at the moment is the number of people who don't believe there is scientific consensus on anthropogenic climate change. We have seen declining statistics of the number of people who say, yes, the scientific community is generally in agreement about man-made climate change. And the same can be true for good information. So all we have to do is we need to repeat ourselves over and over again in as many formats as possible and via as many channels as possible.
Let's bring Max in here. From your perspective, what would you add? What does the data say about what is driving the perception of public division?
We did some studies a couple of years ago that looked at online engagement on Twitter before it turned into X with climate politics. And one of the interesting findings we had is that if you go back to the Paris Agreement in 2015, there was almost no engagement from climate skeptics or climate deniers with the climate issue in general. And what happened between 2015 and 2021 is the growth of this youth movement brought a lot of visibility to climate action, especially in Europe. And then you had this spillover effect starting. So populist politicians who were fighting against these activists started bringing together lots of different communities who were aligned on other issues, for instance, communities against immigration policy, and they were using this as a gateway into opposition to climate action. And actually, if you look at the data, there's a lot of alignment between various different issues, which makes it very difficult to depolarize the climate debate and separate it from broader political divisions.
This brings us to the question, what's being done about it? Now, let's start with the EU. We touched upon the DSA. We touched upon the AI Act. In January of this year, the EU endorsed a landmark declaration on information integrity on climate change, establishing international commitments to promote accurate, evidence-based information on climate issues. Paul, from your perspective, all of those tools and that landmark declaration, are they sufficient?
The key issue today is to make full use of the DSA. And let me say that the Commission provides information on the big platforms like TikTok, YouTube, Meta, how they relate to climate change disinformation and what they do and what they don't do. Can we enforce the DSA in such a way that these platforms take moderation actions to address climate disinformation? I think this is doable, but it's a fight. This type of disinformation is undercutting civic discourse and will have an impact on elections.
As we come to the end of the conversation, let's just look more widely at how we tackle blind spots, how we tackle this rising challenge. Briefly, Max, what would a unified response to climate disinformation need to look like? And secondly, if platforms could only change one thing, what should it be?
The challenge is that this information that operates in the spaces between truth and lie, they're extremely hard to regulate. And I'm not convinced that we will be able to convince platforms to remove this content. And to be honest, I don't think we should. So my argument would be that what we need to be doing is promoting a positive vision of climate action that takes the hands of the people who are not natural allies of the climate movement and gives them a positive vision that says, yes, we want to take away the jobs in the coal industry, but we will give you something else. Just briefly on the issue of financing. I've done research on the financing of the fossil fuel industry by the banking sector. And actually, at the European level, European banks have substantially reduced their underwriting of loans and bonds to fossil fuel projects. But this is not actually true at a global level. Outside of Europe, there is still massive investment in fossil fuels. So we need to remember that we have to build bridges in our local communities at the European level, but also globally with those communities which are still rapidly electrifying. And if we can do that, then we might actually have a positive vision of climate action in the future.
Thank you. Let me invite last reactions to that, last comments from Jenny and from Paul. Jenny, over to you.
So I would agree with Max that we absolutely need more creative and engaging ways to bring the public into a conversation around the energy transition. And again, that isn't just about communications. It's not didactic, telling people things. It's actually engaging them in deliberative democracy. But I would caution against a strategy that only thinks about strengthening the good and putting the onus on the climate sector. I think if we don't weaken the bad, if we don't fundamentally change the business model of disinformation, and if we don't make it unprofitable, unsexy in public life, and if we don't change the incentive structures that exist on social media, then we're never going to have that level playing field for dialogue to take place.
Thank you. Paul?
Let's just be clear. I'm not saying we need new laws. I'm saying we need to fully exploit the DSA, in particular, where it protects the electoral process and civic discourse. And the Commission has to increase the pressure on platforms to take responsibility for the content which they are spreading, in particular in times of AI being automated content. This content must be marked, it must be policed.
Thank you. And you bring us full circle by underlining the point that this really is all about protecting democracy, and the EU has a clear role to play there. So thank you all for giving us plenty to think about in this episode of Just Europe. Did you enjoy the discussion?
Yes, very much.
It's been a pleasure to have you with us, dear listeners. And of course, do stay tuned for our next episode in the Just Europe podcast series. We've got some great content coming up for you.
Just Europe.